I was hiking through the dense forest, the crunching of leaves beneath my boots, the only sound to be heard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees, and I realized I had lost my way. Panic started to set in as I realized I was alone and lost in the wilderness. Just as I was about to give up, I saw a flicker of light in the distance. Excited, I made my way towards it, hoping to find someone who could help me. As I drew closer, I saw that it was a small cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. I knocked on the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty cabin. There was no response, but I could hear strange, muffled sounds coming from inside. Cautiously, I stepped into the cabin and called out again. That's when I saw them. 3 figures huddled in the corner, their backs turned to me. As I got closer, I realized they were covered in dirt and blood, their hair matted and tangled. Suddenly, they turned around, revealing their faces, which were twisted in a grotesque grimace. I stumbled back, my heart racing with fear as the figure started to move towards me. I tried to run, but they were too fast, their hands grabbing at me, their nails digging into my flesh. I screamed for help, but no one answered, and I knew I was going to die. Just as I thought it was over, the cabin door burst open and a group of search and rescue workers rushed in. They subdued the figures, who turned out to be lost hikers who had been trapped in the cabin for days. As they took me to safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. From that day on, I never went hiking alone again, and I always made sure to stay on the beaten path. The memory of that encounter would haunt me for the rest of my life. The rescue team wrapped me in a warm blanket and led me to safety. They explained that the hikers I had encountered had gone missing a week ago and were presumed dead. It was a miracle that they had found them alive, albeit barely. As we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't help but to feel grateful for my life. I vowed to never take my safety for granted and to always be cautious when venturing into the unknown. But as we reached the outskirts of the forest, a sense of dread washed over me. I turned back to look at the cabin and saw that it had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty clearing. I shuddered, wondering if the hikers had been the only ones trapped in that cursed place. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, that something far more sinister was lurking in the shadows. To this day, I avoid hiking in that forest, afraid of what horrors it may hold. And every time I close my eyes, I see the twisted faces of those lost hikers, their eyes pleading for help, their bodies covered in dirt and blood. The memory of that terrifying encounter will haunt me for the rest of my days, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the unknown. I always thought the legends about skinwalkers were just that, legends. Tales to scare children around the campfire, to keep them away from wandering too far into the wilderness. But then I came face to face with one, and I realized that they were all too real. It happened when I was out camping in the middle of nowhere, far away from civilization. I'd always loved the wilderness, the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. But that night, something felt off. The air was thick and oppressive, and I could hear strange noises coming from the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like something was scratching at the walls of my tent, trying to get in. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but I knew deep down that it was something far more sinister. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The air grew still and quiet, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me. That's when I heard the whispering. It was a low, guttural sound, like nothing I had ever heard before. It was coming from just outside of my tent, and it seemed to be growing louder and louder, and more insistent by the second. I wanted to run, to flee into safety of my car and drive away from this place. But something held me back. Some morbid curiosity that made me want to know what was out there. And then it happened. The tent shook violently, as if something was trying to tear it apart from the outside. I could hear the fabric tearing, and I knew that I was in mortal danger. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The air grew still and quiet once again, and I was left sitting in my tent, alone with my thoughts. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there, waiting for the sun to rise, listening to the whispers that seemed to echo in my head. And when the dawn finally broke, I knew that I had to get out of there. I packed up my things and got into my car, driving as fast as I could, away from that cursed place. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that had latched onto me like a parasite. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that wilderness again. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I know that there are things out there that we can't explain or understand. Skinwalkers are real, and they are not just legends. They are something far more terrifying, something that can shatter our understanding of the world around us. And I fear that they are still out there, waiting in the darkness for their next victim.